So we've got Imperial Fists with +1 to wound when they're static with heavy weapons, new Scout Wargear changes, and a few teasers of detachment rules and a new version of Oath of Moment. Let's talk through one big Space Marine rules leak from the new Codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines, and in this video I thought we'd talk through a few of the changes from the upcoming Codex that appear to have leaked to the internet a little bit early. The Space Marine Codex is expected in the not too distant future right now. We've had it announced and all the new models, and I'd guess that it probably won't be too far behind the Tyranids. If we are getting slightly substantial leaks of this sort of scale, hopefully it won't be too far away. Leaks do seem to be the norm, not the exception with Games Workshop. We had massive leaks before 10th edition came out, but perhaps surprisingly little from the new Tyranids. These leaks were spotted on Discord, and thanks to those who made me aware of them. The original source of them wasn't entirely clear, though the word more leaks was mentioned. Presumably it's going to be someone who's gotten their hands on the Space Marine Codex early, or potentially some playtest rules. As always with leaks coming out to the internet, these are definitely not 100% confirmed, though they do seem to be entirely in line with what Games Workshop's teased so far, and do corroborate kind of well with other small teasers that I've heard. In any case, I'd definitely treat them with a pinch of salt at the moment, treat them as interesting teasers, though my guess is that these will probably turn out to be at least broadly accurate. For the content of the leak, it looks like we've got some detachment names and some rough clues as to their theming and keywords, just a few specific rules and teasers for the Anvilus Siege Force and the Stormlance Task Force, a few hints as to the wargear of the Scout Squad, and then some broad teasers regarding Oath of Moment, characters in the new Codex, and points cost going forward. First up, perhaps the new detachments might be the single most interesting thing that's going to be coming out of Codex Space Marines. They do seem to be the main way they're trying to add interest and making armies feel a little bit different to each other, and perhaps placing some incentives for certain models to be played in some armies a bit more than others. Apparently the new detachments in Codex Space Marines won't be designed to lock out any models. None of them have hard limits on any of the units that you can take out of the Codex, so you could basically take any force and field it as any detachment, but as with plenty of things like the Tyrannid detachments that we've seen, lots of the supporting rules will help with one style of unit or one style of play. Say for example, the Crusher Stampede for the Tyranids had loads of support for monsters, to the extent where you probably want to take mostly monsters in that list, as otherwise you'd probably be better running the formation as something else if you weren't. Those restrictions include things like chapter-specific characters as well, so they're not going to be a mirror of things like, say, the Blood Angels Sons of Sanguinius one, where the only chapter-unique stuff that you could take was from Blood Angels. These ones will be able to mix and match for any of the chapters and the unique characters, which I think is probably for the best, even if the detachments are really quite heavily themed round the 6 big chapters plus a First Company one. Within the detachments, the buffs tend to affect all units and aren't just locked to any one keyword, though some might definitely be a lot more relevant to certain units compared with others. In particular, the stratagems might be a little bit more focused on certain keywords. Say for example, in the Vanguard one that's kind of like the Raven Guard formation, a lot of the stratagems might get better or only be able to target things like Phobos and Scout units. Otherwise though, detachments sound like they're broadly going to be really quite similar to Codex Tyranids as you'd expect. 4 enhancements, 6 stratagems, and all of them get the Armour of Contempt stratagem. That does seem like it's just going to be core to all Space Marines at this stage, the one way you worsen enemy AP and make their power armour a bit better. In the Codex there are 7 different detachments, Games Workshop had previously confirmed that, and these names do seem to line up quite well with the ones that they'd teased, plus a few new ones that I don't believe that we'd heard before. We've got the First Company Task Force, which is supposed to be just a generic First Company one, with stratagems focused around the 3 veteran type units and Terminators. The Stormlance Task Force, which broadly feels like it's a White Scars one, assault focused and some stratagems that use the mounted keyword. The Vanguard Spearhead is the Raven Guard one, that one's more focused around infantry and some Scout and Phobos type things. The Firestorm Assault Force sounds like it's made to exemplify Salamanders. That one kind of feels like it's supposed to be focused around Space Marine Rhino Rush really, or maybe Impulsor Rush in the Primaris age, infantry and close range shooting, and in particular a lot of support for transports. The Ironstorm Spearhead is Iron Hands related, that one's got some help for vehicles and walkers. The Anvilus Siege Force is themed around the Imperial Fists, that's just general shooting and static gunline type boosts, doesn't seem to be enormously Gravis-centric or anything like that. And then of course we've got the Gladius Task Force, the Ultramarines as seen already. There were a few details out of just a couple of the detachments. The Anvilus Siege Force has its primary rule as Shield of the Imperium apparently. This one feels like it's meant to represent a fairly static Imperial Fist gun line. I guess rather than getting your combat doctrines or similar things to that, you'd get ranged weapons or get the heavy keyword, and then perhaps most excitingly, heavy weapons that remain stationary not just get a +1 to hit, but they also get a +1 to wound as well, and if anything, that's an even better buff to anything that had the keyword already, I think. I feel like that's really quite an interesting one. Definitely on paper, a +1 to hit's really quite handy, and certainly the +1 to wound, but I feel like in reality, in 10th edition, you often are just needing to move to gain lines of sight, or moving to objectives, or potentially getting out of the way of enemies, and there's definitely going to be plenty of your armies that just can't afford to just sit still and reap those benefits. I guess it's kind of nice for any longer range vehicles that either do or don't have the heavy keyword. Seems strong for things like bolt rifles and heavy bolt rifles. Getting +1 to hit and wound when static does seem really quite good for an Imperial Fist gun line. And for other things that have the heavy keyword, at least at the moment, we've got Hellblasters, Eliminators, and Devastators. I think all of those could be really quite interesting with a +1 to wound on their weapons. All of those have at least fairly good range. Seems pretty cool, though I suppose there might be some chance of things having their weapon characteristics modified. If the Space Marines Codex does follow the Tyranids one, though, then I'd expect that most unit stat lines and special rules and things would remain the same. The changes between the Index and the Codex for the Tyranids weren't huge. Otherwise, there were a couple of stratagems and an enhancement mentioned for the Anvilus Siege Force. One command point for a stratagem called Battle Drill Recall. This one gives you sustained hits when you're shooting, and if you're static, then you get critical hits on a 5+ as well. I guess typically that'd be a +25% damage, or usually +40% damage if you're static and you were hitting on a 2+ already most of the time. That really does seem like a very good benefit if you're firing with heavy weapons as well, and to get you a whole load of extra hits that would then go on to have a +1 to wound as well. Just seems like you could make some units enormously efficient for 1 CP there. That seems like a very powerful one if that does remain the way it is all the way to the Codex. I feel like that could be played on one important gunline unit each turn. Otherwise, seems they also have a reactive shooting one called Hail of Vengeance, a 2 command point return fire in the enemy turn that triggers if you've got a squad that's lost a model. I feel like we've seen that stratagem for a few armies so far. The Dark Angels have one called Grim Retribution that's kind of similar, so that one only costs 1 CP, so maybe it isn't quite as exciting. Finally, for one of the enhancements that's supposedly around the 20 to 30 point mark is Architect of War. I feel like this one's been a name from the previous Imperial Fist Codex before, and this one is a fairly simple one, allowing a squad to ignore cover if this leader is leading them. Kind of hard to go wrong with a nice direct shooting damage boost. Could be handy on something like Hellblasters or Bolter Gun Line if you're going fluffy Imperial Fists. Feels like between a bunch of these you could make bolters particularly savage if you really wanted to try and make them work and get a bunch of layered buffs on them. They are heavy, so you could have them hitting on a 2+ and wounding on +1 to wound. Use that Battle Drill Recall on them for a whole bunch of exploding hits on 5s and 6s, and then have Architect of War to ignore cover as well, kind of relevant on lower AP stuff like bolt rifles. Moving on, for the new Scout Squad, I was kind of curious as to if there'd be any surprises on the datasheets, and the leak did drop a few hints. Apparently it's going to be mostly the same as the old datasheet without any major changes and similar sort of special rules. And then for War Gear, Warhammer Community has basically previewed this already. You've got the choice of the same shotguns, bolt guns, or combat blade and pistol if you want them. Only one can take a sniper rifle, which fits with Games Workshop's previews and not showing us more of them. There doesn't appear to be any sort of special rules for the grapnel launcher pistol apparently. And unfortunately the Scout Sniper Squad is indeed gone from the Codex as expected. Kind of makes sense as Games Workshop hasn't revealed any new models for that kit, even if it will be a shame to lose the datasheet. They were quite handy with not being able to be targeted outside of 12-inch range. Next up, supposedly Oath of Moment might well be changing. I feel like if so, this might be one of the least popular changes out of the new Space Marine Codex. The leak seems to think that it's going to be changing to the Combat Patrol version, with only full rerolls to hit the target, and you don't get the full rerolls to wound anymore. If that's true, then that would be a massively significant nerf to Oath of Moment, and definitely hamper the Space Marine's ability to just absolutely focus loads of damage on any one target. I must admit I was a little bit dubious about the rule when Games Workshop first previewed it, but it seems that with the points cost and the other options that other factions get, it seems to be very balanced broadly in 40k, Certainly a fair bit stronger against anything with big tough units to try and tank a bunch of damage, and a bit weaker against other things. But with Space Marines largely being kind of mid to low tier, it's definitely not broken. If the wound rerolls do go away, it'll be a fairly big blow to devastating wounds and mid-strength weaponry versus proper anti-tank guns. Both of those can be very punchy against hard targets with full wound rerolls. Apparently the wound rerolls might come back as some form of first company buff once per game, but beyond that, for most detachments they'd be gone. For points, apparently the upshot is that it's a similar sort of deal to Codex Tyranids. Points are mostly a mix of pre and post data slate points, though a few don't reflect either version. Tyranids certainly had that, but they also had a fair few slightly weird increases compared with before. Fingers crossed Space Marines can avoid that kind of thing. As with the Tyranid Codex, they also have a QR code to link to the current updated point system. And for that reason, I guess that the updated points will be the digital ones, not the one in the book once more. Though I suppose we'll have to wait and see on that front, as I guess Space Marines will be uncharted territory from Games Workshop. The Tyranids Codex weirdly had its points revealed and then had them immediately cancelled by the data slate. Will be interesting to see whether Games Workshop decides to let the Codex points stand, or just say that they're keeping on going with the digital points costs, and whether they choose to update them when the Codex comes out, when presumably a few things change and they have to add in a few new units. Another thing I was very curious about with the Space Marine Codex was how characters are going to be handled. Apparently in the book there's not going to be any such thing as Primaris characters, so you won't have the differential between a Primaris captain and a regular captain, and the same for other equivalents like the Librarian and Chaplain and things. Games Workshop has pulled most of the firstborn equivalents of those miniatures now, bar perhaps one or two like the Chaplain I think. And as we talked about in a previous video, it looks like the firstborn characters are probably going to go the way of Legends now, if they do even support those wargear choices at all. A few firstborn characters do appear to remain in the book though, specifically Vulcan Hestan, Lysander, Cato Sicarius and Pedro Cantor are all present, though most others beyond those ones have gone. Apparently Chaplain Cassius is confirmed gone, he's Death Watch only now apparently. If these turn out to be accurate, then I'm kind of wondering what their logic is here. I guess they're still making and selling the miniature for Vulcan Hestan, though I believe that Lysander, Captain Sicarius and Pedro Cantor have all been range rotators. I'm perhaps kind of surprised to see them remaining there as a result. I did think that they'd be going the way of Legends the same way as Yarrick did. Finally, for leaked teasers and previews, we've got a few rules for the Stormlance task force. This one appears to be the White Scars themed one that's focused around bikes and mounted units, and their special rule is basically just taking a leaf out of the White Scars book from 8th and 9th edition. Lightning Assault allows you to advance and charge, and fall back and charge as well. As with before, it's not just limited to bikes or anything like that, so any units will be able to do that. As a result, though, does seem that it's going to be a very melee-heavy detachment, as you're not really going to care too much whether you can advance and charge if you're a ranged unit for the most part. Seems unlikely that they'll be getting any extra rules like +1 damage on the charge unless it's a stratagem, though. As a result, they might feel like an army that moves very fast but doesn't hit quite as hard. The advance and charge is definitely very useful for both fast and slow units out of the Space Marine armory. Finally, we've got a couple of stratagem teasers and an enhancement from this detachment. For one command point, there's one called Wind Swift. This one's a reactive movement of 6 inches if an enemy unit ends within 9 inches of your unit. This one sounds like it's just going to be a directly superior version of the squad tactics from Gladius, seeing as this one moves 6 inches all the time. And unless there's any further restrictions not mentioned, sounds like you could do it on really quite big and important units as well. Maybe even do things like allow tanks to huddle behind terrain if the enemy gets too close to them, or just backpedal frantically to try and keep them out of combat. That one's definitely got the potential to have some enormous power in the right situation for just 1 CP. A little bit dependent on your opponent to move close to you though. Otherwise, for one command point, we've got Ride Fast, Ride Hard. This one is targeting only mounted or fly vehicle units in the shooting phase, and they get both a -1 to hit and also a -1 to wound. I guess that's going to be there for your Outriders, ATVs, or Storm Speeders for the most part now. There aren't really all that many mounted units left in Codex Space Marines after they've taken out the bike squads, the scout bikes, and the attack bikes. I guess kind of somewhat dependent on those units being good, but in terms of reactive durability stratagems, it does seem like quite a good one. -1 to hit and wound is really quite powerful. I guess if you're using a storm speeder or two to mark some targets for some heavy firepower, that could be good. Or if it makes sense to build around a big unit of outriders led by a chaplain or something, I suppose you could be potentially protecting really quite a lot of value there. Finally, for one of their 4 enhancements, there's one called Hunter's Instincts. Again, like a fair few of these enhancements and things, this one seems like it's kind of familiar from other detachments. This one allows you to count your units as being 1 round higher for strategic reserve, so you could arrive on the table on turn 1 or arrive as if it were round 3 on round 2. Probably a fair bit more relevant on a firepower unit compared with an assault one, I'd guess. You could guarantee keeping them off the board and then turn them up somewhere useful to get some good lines of sight. You would need to have a character attached to the squad though, so I guess it would have to make sense, maybe something like a lieutenant, giving your unit some lethal hits or something. Overall seems like a fun little taste of the rules in any case. Overall, at least with Oath of Moment though, I feel like Space Marine lists seem to be a bit more focused on range versus melee. Will be interesting to see if adding in old White Scar's advance and charge across the board for every unit all the time will be enough to make them more worth it. I guess you can already get it for 1 turn with Gladius, and then flex into advance and charge for 1 CP otherwise. In any case, let me know your thoughts on the leaks. How reliable do you reckon these are? And if they do turn out to be accurate, what are you either excited or disappointed by? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular Warhammer 40k videos, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.